worth of experience in the field. He is a part of the special envoy of the World Wildlife Fund International and is currently the convener of the Nature Positive Initiative. On this episode, we discuss the concept of nature positive and how the initiative aims to achieve nature positive by 2030 and the way forward beyond. Welcome, Marco, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
First question is, what exactly is nature positive?
So the first thing to say is that nature positive is not a slogan, like it may sound, but actually it is a goal. It is comparable to carbon neutral in the climate space. Carbon neutral is achieved by net zero emissions, and nature positive is achieved by net positive biodiversity. In simple words, means that we need to deliver more nature, not less. More nature is a measurable goal. That means a net biodiversity outcome by 2030 on a 2020 baseline. So more nature at the end of the decade than at its starts. And with this ambition and its measurability as well, it makes it also a very disruptive goal, as you can imagine. Because in order to achieve a net positive biodiversity by the end of the decade, we will have to protect more of the nature left on the planet, restore much of what we have lost or degraded, and particularly transition key economic sectors today responsible for nature loss, the big five: agriculture, fisheries, forestry, extractives, infrastructure, moving those sectors from being nature negative today to nature positive tomorrow. And of course, redirect all the finances, private and public, that will allow those transitions to happen. So that's nature positive. Net positive biodiversity, more nature at the end of the decade than at the start.
Why do human societies need to become more nature positive, and how are we impacted by biodiversity loss?
Yeah, so intuitively, I think we all know that nature is the foundation of all aspects of our existence, of our life. Provides the oxygen we breathe. Roughly half of the world vegetation provides half of the oxygen we breathe, and the other half is provided by the ocean, much less appreciated but equally important. Nature provides the water we drink, provides all the food that we grow, provide water for our activities from agriculture to industry, provides materials like timber, and most of life-saving medicines are still derived by natural compounds. But even engineering innovation are often inspired by nature, so-called biomimicry. So nature is the foundation for almost, I would say, all aspects of our lives. And in classic economic terms, if you like, has been calculated that half of the world GDP depends on healthy ecosystem providing a variety of goods and services. And of course, natural ecosystems on land, fresh water, in the ocean also absorb over half of the CO2 anthropogenic emissions, the emissions that we generate. And so to stay below the 1.5 degrees limit that we've given ourselves in the Paris Agreement, net zero emissions won't be enough. We need also to preserve and restore nature's ability to sequester carbon from the atmosphere and store it in its ecosystems. So the understanding of how nature is important and how important are nature's contributions to humanity has been growing over the last few years, so that today, increasingly, nature loss is not any longer an isolated ecological issue, but actually an issue affecting our economy, our social cohesion, health, well-being. In other words, is, together with climate change, becoming a security issue for humanity. So a major shift in the perception from years and years, decades and centuries in which we have been taking nature for granted. Now we know that we can't any longer, and we depend on nature, in fact, more than nature depends on us.
So could you elaborate a bit about the Nature Positive Initiative and the global goal for nature? Also, what is your role in this campaign?
So, despite decades of efforts, the global trends on the loss of nature remain deeply alarming. And so, urgent and upscaled action is needed to address the biodiversity crisis this decade and conserve and restore natural ecosystems that underpin humanity's sustainable and equitable development options. The purpose of the Nature Positive initiative is exactly to stimulate and support the world in addressing this accelerating biodiversity crisis by meeting the crucial goal of halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. And the initiative wants to bring together many organizations, institutions from all sectors in society, from environmental and humanitarian civil society organizations to business, financial institutions and platforms, governments, of course, to all support the implementation of a nature positive goal by also developing guidance to ensure a true net positive biodiversity outcomes. And true is a key word here because the word nature positive is wisely used often, as I said at the beginning, as a slogan rather than a measurable goal. But actually, it is a goal. It is a goal that is meant to bound companies and governments to reduce their footprint and to invest in nature conservation and restoration so that we have a net positive outcome. So the initiative is supporting the societal effort across different sectors to deliver more nature by the end of the decade, not continuing to lose it.
So, a goal of the initiative is halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030 from a 2020 baseline. So, what exactly do you mean by a 2020 baseline? And can you elaborate a bit on the baseline syndrome which is affecting conservation?
So any goal, in order to be measured and therefore to be achieved, needs a baseline as a reference and a deadline as an endpoint. And so with reference to the nature positive goal, we have identified 2020 as the baseline for delivering more nature in 2030. So that in 2030 we have more nature than in 2020. And more nature means more natural ecosystems, more species and greater populations of species, more intact natural processes, basically the usual metrics that are normally used to measure nature and biodiversity. So net positive outcomes by 2030 on a 2020 baseline, it's a clear, simple and measurable goal and give us a clear reference point to actually measure progress. And of course, it's also highly ambitious. It means that after centuries of, and particularly the last decades of accelerating nature loss, we will have not only to halt, but also to reverse the loss, so to restore part of nature that we lost. And of course, this decade, the effort by 2030 is just the start. We will need to continue to restore nature in the decades after 2030 because there is plenty of potential for nature to come back in many degraded regions of the world with incredible benefits to the local communities, the local economy, and the global stability of climate and ecosystems. Science is telling us that unless we reverse nature loss and maintain roughly half of the planet as a minimum in a natural state, allowing ecosystem to function, unless we do that, entire system from weather systems like monsoon or oceanic currents, entire ecosystems like polar ice sheets or glaciers, coral reefs, and also entire ecoregions like the Amazon, for example, will occur in a change of state, tipping point. This will make the world look very different from today, and we will be challenged to adapt to a much more unstable and dangerous planet where extreme climatic events will intensify and nature will fail to provide many of the services and goods that we've been enjoying until now. So this is a crucial goal for the security and the safe future of humanity.
So, how exactly are the sustainable development goals linked to the concept of nature positive?
Yeah, it's completely linked because we now know that the economy and society, a stable, healthy society, are subsidiaries of ecology, meaning that there is not going to be prosperity, equality in a degraded planet. And we're beginning to see the effects of climate change on the most vulnerable communities, for example, around the world. And nature loss will continue to aggravate that situation. So a nature positive economy, a nature positive society, is one that preserves and helps regenerate nature as a necessary condition for human development in all its forms. There's never been a better time for humans on one hand, because we've been developing and achieving a lot of progress on different fronts. Think about life expectancy, think about extreme poverty, childbirth mortality. All these indicators have been improving over the last particularly few decades. Of course, not equitably around the world, but overall there's been progress. But the paradox of today is that, and it is also the failure of our current economic model, is that on one hand, we have developed at the expenses of nature. And so we've seen nature declining. And so effectively, the decline of nature now is beginning to undermine prospect for future progress, unless we change course and we develop sustainably, but also affecting achieved progress. So we're seeing for the first time climate change affecting extreme poverty levels in a number of regions heavily impacted by extreme weather events. So a stable, predictable planet, which is the reason for our civilization to thrive in the last 1,000 years, is beginning to weaken. And also nature loss and climate change are equally a justice issue because the most vulnerable populations are more affected, and also an intergenerational justice issue because we're leaving our children and future generations a terrible, difficult legacy to deal with. So that's how a nature positive goal underpin the SDGs. There is not going to be a people positive future without a nature positive one.
So, how can businesses contribute to becoming nature positive?
I think the answer is straightforward: by changing. Because the transition from nature negative to nature positive practices is the way a business can contribute to a nature positive future and rectify the mistake and the footprint that it has had until now. Unsustainable production practices has been and is still today the main cause of climate change and nature loss. So business has been and still is the big part of the problem. And business can be a big part of the solution if it embraces transitions towards sustainable practices that lead to stabilization of the climate and net positive biodiversity outcomes. So how to do that? Business needs to first assess the footprint, truly assess their full footprint, avoid and mitigate the footprint, compensate what's in as an avoidable impact, because there are residual unavoidable impact, but just the absolutely unavoidable one. And this is a process that, in order to deliver a nature positive outcome, require high integrity to run these assessments properly. And the nature positive initiative that we mentioned at the beginning, one of the main purposes of the initiative is, in fact, to ensure high integrity in designing and implementing nature positive plans, avoiding failures and greenwashing from a corporate perspective. So ultimately, what will drive businesses to change is not only the growing awareness of the impact that they're having, the pressure from their own employees, from the public, but also we will need regulation to kick in, create level playing field, and also at the same time incentives for businesses to transition to new practices, sustainable, nature positive practices.
What do you think are some of the short and long-term challenges facing the nature positive initiative at a global scale?
Yeah, quite a few, because after centuries of taking nature for granted, now we're talking and declining of nature. We're now talking about reversing all that in a decade. So the first challenge I would say is a cultural one, because as I said earlier, we have always taken nature for granted. Nature was dominant, plentiful, all around us for millennia. We've been evolved competing, extracting, exploiting resources at an increasingly exponentially, in fact, accelerating rate. Because in the early days, nature was able to replenish itself. But under an exponential population growth and coupled with major technological advances, our ability to impact nature, our ability to squeeze out of nature and natural resources has increased exponentially. And with that, our consumption patterns, again, not equitably. Some regions of the world overconsume, some others, of course, are still suffering from for lack of access to resources even. But overall, our consumption exponentially grown. And we know that this is unsustainable because this is based on the delusional idea that we could extract resources at this rate forever, that natural resources are infinite, and they're not. They're not very finite, as we know today. But if you look at the extraction of the use of energy, of water, fish, timber, minerals, all these commodities, all these natural resources have followed an exponential growth of consumption over the last, particularly 70 years. This is what is referred as the Great Acceleration, and we know that this is now absolutely unsustainable, particularly with the population that lives on the planet today, 8 billion people, and with the need to provide to all these 8 billion people decent lives and access to resources. So we are living outside planetary boundaries, and the cultural challenge is to recognize that, to recognize the current failing economic model, and understand the consequences that continuing to degrade the natural world will have on our lives, and particularly on the lives of future generations. So we must stop taking nature for granted. We must recognize nature's material contribution to humanity and start embracing sustainable ways of using natural resources. That's absolutely possible. There are many ways of doing that. There are many examples, local examples. You need to scale that up and make it the new mainstream production and consumption system. A system that values nature in many different ways and uses and stop using nature wastefully and destructively as we've done until now. So a nature positive way.
How exactly does this initiative aim to deliver nature positive outcome by 2030?
Yeah, so after decades of inadequate commitments and inadequate action vis-a-vis nature, last December, in December 2023, the world, under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the Nature Convention, if you like, has adopted a global biodiversity framework, which is basically a global plan to address biodiversity loss, including the mission that sets exactly the measurable goal, global goal of halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030, effectively a nature positive goal. So, but alongside this mission, the framework includes, for the first time, a number of other measurable targets to deliver this ambition. In summary, because the plan is quite complex and holistic, but in essence, it sets, first of all, a target of protecting 30% at least of the natural ecosystems on land, freshwater, and the ocean remaining on the planet. Secondly, a target of restoring 30% of degraded ecosystems, and to increase dramatically the funding for biodiversity conservation from about 10 billion spent per year today, particularly in the north today, to 30 billion per year, so roughly tripling the current public investment, and particularly directing those that increase to economically developing countries, where the need for nature conservation is higher and biodiversity is higher. But also reaching an overall $200 billion per year for biodiversity conservation, which is roughly doubling the current domestic and international investment overall. And so, increasingly substantially the resources for nature conservation. There is a weakness of the agreement that because it does indicate key economic sectors that needs to be reformed, but it doesn't attach targets to that reform. It just mentions some of the sectors like agriculture, like fisheries, like forestry. But there is an incredibly important additional target, which is very specific, very precise, and it is about the elimination, the phasing out, or the redirection of $500 billion of harmful subsidies for nature. It's more or less a third what is estimated by most being the harmful subsidies to unsustainable agriculture, to unsustainable forestry, fisheries, infrastructure that today are given out to private sector from governments and have a bad, harmful impact on nature. So that's a super important target as well. So all this together constitutes the backbone of a really, probably the most ambitious and most measurable ever global plan for biodiversity. So that's how we're going to be able to deliver a nature-positive outcome, nature-positive future.
So how does the Nature Positive initiative plan to measure its impact?
Yeah, so I would say there are two categories of metrics that needs to be looked at, and both equally important. One category is about the metrics to measure the footprint of each company or sector, and also measure the progress of that company and sector in reducing their footprint. So there are metrics specific to the type of footprint that each company have. So a mining company will have a different type of footprint from a fishing company or for an agricultural company or from a retail company that sources products from different landscapes. But each company should be is in a position and must assess their footprint and develop metrics to measure progress in reducing it. That's one first set of metrics specific to the company footprint. Then there is another set of metrics that are more about measuring the end result, the nature positive outcome, the state of nature at the end of all these efforts of reducing the footprint. And this is about measuring ecosystem extent, ecosystem condition, measuring species population, species extinction risk, and also natural processes that are underpinning and supporting ecosystem and biodiversity and species. So these are the kind of metrics that will give us a sense in 2030 whether a good sense of whether we have increased the amount of ecosystem, the amount of population, species population, so reduce the risk of extinction, and therefore we have moved into a more nature, not less kind of situation, a net positive biodiversity outcome.
So how can individuals contribute to the nature positive future?
We are using the right word here, contribute, because at the end of the day, a nature positive outcome, a global nature positive outcome, has to be delivered by all actors coming together and doing their part. Individuals, we talked about a lot about companies, financial institutions, of course, providing the money to shift practices, governments with the regulation, but also individuals play an important role. And I would say consumption is the most important dimension because it's a major driver of the current impact of nature. And so first of all, consume less, because we're consuming in many regions of the world, not everywhere, of course, as I said earlier, but in the richest regions of the world, there is no doubt we're consuming too much of almost everything, and we are wasting too much of almost everything. So consume less in general, but also consume better, more sustainably. And so particularly looking and focusing on energy, so sourcing as much as possible, as much as we can from renewable energy, but also food is the second big driver because it's really is at the top of the list of the sectors, commodities that are impacting nature today. And so much more than other commodities, which are equally also important, like clothing or plastic, etc. But food really topped the list. And so consuming less and consuming sustainable food, we know that animal proteins, for example, are having a much higher impact compared to plant-based proteins and food diets. And so shifting diets is super important. Doesn't need to be a radical shift. That's up to personal choices. But what is necessary is to reduce the consumption of the high footprint food that today is very widespread in our diets.
I've worked in conservation for over 40 years. What have been some of your fondest memories and achievements from your conservation career?
Well, as you say, 40 years is a long time, so the memories are many, and many are quite exciting. There are also some tricky ones, and clearly, like everyone, some moment of failures and desperation. But look, if you focus on the fondest memories, I think in the early days, one of the first things that really, in a way, formed my approach to conservation was an experience I had in my own region. I was born by the sea. I was seeing on the horizon this island since I was a child. And when I had the chance to visit this island, I went there. It was a pristine Mediterranean island, beautiful, full of nature. And then suddenly was under attack by a lot of projects of very mass tourism development. So with the local young people in the island and partnering with fishers, we mounted a campaign for the declaration of a protected area. The time was the largest marine protected area in Europe. We won the local elections. we convinced the government to establish a national park. The national park is still active and thriving to this day. So that's a big memory in the early days. Later on, one other thing is that we convinced the Indonesian government to establish a new regulation that allows private companies and NGOs to manage forest concessions, not only for cutting trees like it used to be, but also for restoring concession already logged over. And so we received the first concession, still there, Harapan Forest, 100,000 hectares of lowland, beautiful forest, teeming with tigers and wildlife and beautiful forest all around. And then many others followed. So that was an example of a policy change that triggered action, conservation on the ground. And finally, the fondest memory closest to now is December last year when, after 3 years of hard lobbying for the global biodiversity framework, we've seen that approved by almost 200 governments around the world. And it was a moment, a Paris moment for nature for all of us.
So my final question for you is that what has been some of your greatest learnings from your conservation career?
First of all, always focus on impacts. There are many ways. You need to be flexible on how to get there, how to build a pathway to success, to impact. But at the end of the day, what matters is impact. And so be clear on what you want to achieve and be able to measure that impact and really then develop a strategy and a pathway to deliver it. It's what I learned and what I would recommend everybody moving in conservation. Focus on impact and then be flexible on how you get there, including engaging with odd, perhaps unconventional partners. Engage also with some of the players and stakeholders that are part of the problem, but nevertheless is our job and increasingly to shift their approach, shift their practices. So engage them in a way that includes also listening to their perspectives, to their needs. And sometimes it's not easy, but it's super important if you really want to achieve impact to scale and impact in the long term. The other thing that I learned is that it's so important to work at both levels and connect both levels, local and global. So global policies like the Global Biodiversity Framework I mentioned is super important to drive impact downstream, but equally it's critical that we make sure that ultimately impact on landscape and seascapes around the world is actually happening. Because often global policies remain global, abstract, non-implemented, non-enforced, and of course that's a complete failure. And so connecting the two levels, local, where impacting needs to happen, where actually economy meets the environment, where local communities and companies make decisions, and decisions that can affect or nature, or can in fact help nature thrive and regenerate. This is a fundamental level, but also the global level or the national level, the policy level, where the goals, the directions are set, where the incentives are developed, that will help and drive those impacts, those changes at the local level. So connect the two, try to, as much as possible, work in making sure that these two levels are connected and supporting each other. But maybe one last thing to say on this is because perhaps some young people are listening to the podcast. I know that there is right now a lot of anxiety about the future, and is justified because the trends of climate and nature, but also social economic trends related to all this destabilization on the planet are worrying. But I think to the young people, I like to say, first of all, don't despair. Be angry for what you see happening in the world, but direct your frustration in advocating for and in driving change, starting from your own lifestyle, as well as your using your powers of voters and consumers to influence society and economy at a broader scale. But most importantly, don't give up, don't succumb to anxiety or to cynicism, because we will have to continue to do our best to push for change. We know what inactions will lead us to. We know that inaction will lead us to a catastrophic future. And so actually, I will turn it, anxiety and cynicism and pessimism on its head and say, the challenges of today are unprecedented, but be excited about that. Be excited because it is this generation, it is your generation, not the next one, that has the amazing and unmissable opportunity to build the more sustainable and safer and equitable future, a nature-positive future, one that respects, one based on respect and responsibility, one that recognizes nature intrinsic value on one hand, but also indispensability and the material value of nature to us, to our future. So keep up, don't give up, and focus on real impact and real change at all levels, including starting from our own, initially from our own lifestyles.
So that is a very positive way to end the podcast. Thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
So I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends